So here's an interesting book. It's called the Septuagint, and in the Septuagint, there's included the Apocrypha. The Septuagint was actually translated under the Ptolemies, and it's called Septuagint because it actually means 70, and there's all the myths and legends surrounding the Septuagint, which are kind of fantastic. And there's the real history, and then there's the superstitious history. So this is actually the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and I believe, as far as I know, I need to do more research, that the oldest known manuscripts in existence actually come from the Septuagint. And even though we know the Hebrew language is older, the oldest copies of manuscripts are actually of the Septuagint, which help to verify the factual accounts of the Hebrew. So, and even in the New Testament, sometimes they quote the Septuagint Old Testament, and then sometimes in the New Testament they quote the Hebrew Old Testament. So sometimes they're quoting the Septuagint, which is the Greek copy of the Old Testament, and sometimes they're quoting the Hebrew, which is the Hebrew copy of the Old Testament. So I would just like to read to you the preface. So that will take a few minutes, and hopefully you find it interesting. So here we go. This is the preface in the book of the Septuagint. It says, "This edition of the Septuagint, including Apocrypha, giving the complete Greek text along with a parallel English translation by Sir Lancelot Charles Lee Brinton, who lived from 1807 to 1862, was first published in London in 1851. The Septuagint, from the Latin Septuaginta, meaning 70, and frequently referred to by the Roman numeral LXX, 70, right, is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The name derives from the tradition that it was made by 70 or 72 Jewish scholars at Alexandria, Egypt, during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus from 285 to 247 BC. So that was a long time ago. It has been preserved in a large number of manuscript copies of the original, and the Greek text in Brinton's edition is based on Vaticanus, an early 4th century manuscript, with some reliance on other texts, particularly Alexandrinus, a 5th century manuscript. Although it is not completely understood either when or why the translation was originally done, it is clear that it in large measure reflects the common language of the period and became the Bible of Greek-speaking Jews and then later of the Christians. It is worth noting that the Septuagint differs from the Hebrew Old Testament in certain ways. Number one, the Greek text varies at many points from the corresponding Hebrew text. Number two, the order of the biblical books is not the same. The threefold division of the Hebrew canon into the law, prophets, and writings is not followed in the LXX, the Septuagint. And number three, several books not found in the Hebrew are included in this LXX, Septuagint. These books are known as the Apocrypha in the English Bible. While the majority of the Old Testament quotations rendered by the New Testament authors are borrowed directly from the Septuagint, a number of times they provide their own translations which follows the Hebrew text against the Septuagint. In general, the vocabulary and style of the Septuagint is reflected in the theological terms and phraseology common by the New Testament writers, and therefore takes on particular significance for a better overall understanding of the Scriptures. It is not surprising, due to its early widespread use and enduring influence in the Church, that the order of the biblical books in the Septuagint, rather than that of the Hebrew Old Testament, became the accepted order. Although rejected by Protestants as non-canonical, the apocryphal writings here or the apocryphal writings have enduring value as a literary and historical record of the intertestamental period. They often provide important background and illustrative material for a better understanding of the New Testament world, and thus the New Testament itself. So I thought you might find that interesting about this, and let me see. There's more, just some little facts. So in the introduction, it says an historical account of the Septuagint version. The earliest version of the Old Testament scriptures, which is extant, or of which we possess any certain knowledge, is the translation executed at Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Christian era. This version has been so habitually known by the name of the Septuagint that the attempt of some learned men in modern times to introduce the designation of the Alexandrian version as more correct has been far from successful. The history of the origin of this translation was embellished with various fables at so early a period that it has been a work of patient, critical research in latter times to bring into plain light the facts which may be regarded as well authenticated. We need not wonder that but little is known with accuracy on the subject, for with regard to the ancient versions of the Scriptures, in general, we possess no information whatever as to the time or place of their execution, or by whom they were made. We simply find such versions in use at particular times, and thus we gather the fact that they must have been previously executed. If, then, our knowledge of the origin of the Septuagint be meager, it is at least more extensive than that which we possess of other translations. Interesting. After the conquest of Alexander had brought Egypt under Macedonian rule, the newly founded city of Alexandria became especially a place where the Greek language, although by no means in its purest form, was the medium of written and spoken communication amongst the varied population there brought together. This Alexandria dialect is the idiom in which the Septuagint version was made. Amongst other inhabitants of Alexandria, the number of Jews was considerable. Many appear to have settled there even from the first founding of the city, and it became the residence of many more during the reign of the first Ptolemy. Hence, the existence of the sacred books of the Jews would easily become known to the Greek population. The earliest writer who gives an account of the Septuagint version is Aristobulus, a Jew who lived at the commencement of the 2nd century BC. He says that the version of the law into Greek was completed under the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and that Demetrius Phalereus had been employed about it. Now Demetrius died about the beginning of the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and hence it has been reasonably inferred that Aristobulus is a witness that the work of translation had been commenced under Ptolemy Soter. Different opinions have been formed as to what is intended by Aristobulus when he speaks of the law. Some consider that he refers merely to the Pentateuch, while others extend the signification in the Old Testament scriptures in general. The former opinion appears to be favored by the strict meaning of the terms used, the latter by the mode in which the Jews often applied the name of the law to the whole of their sacred writings. The fact may, however, be regarded as certain that prior to the year 285 BC, the Septuagint version had been commenced, and that in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, either the books in general, or at least an important part of them, had been completed. So, this goes on, but I just thought that you might find some of this interesting because it gives us a little history of the Bible. So, there's I'm going to read just a little more, so I'll probably try to keep it under 15 minutes, so here we go. Some, in rejecting the fabulous embellishments, have also discarded all connected with them. They have then sought to devise new hypotheses as to the origin of the version, Some have thus supposed that the translation was made by Alexandrian Jews for their own use, in order to meet a necessity which they had felt to have a version of the Scriptures in the tongue which had become vernacular to them. There would be, however, many difficulties in the way of this hypothesis. We would hardly suppose that in a space of 35 years the Alexandrian Jews had found such a translation needful or desirable. We must also bear in mind that we find at this period no trace of any versions having been made by Jews into the languages of other countries in which they had continued for periods much longer than that of their settlement at Alexandria. So the most reasonable conclusion is that the version was executed for the Egyptian king, and that Hellenistic Jews afterwards used it as they became less and less familiar with the language of the original. If the expression of Aristobulus does not designate the whole of the books of the Old Testament, as translated in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, the question arises, when were the other books besides the Pentateuch turned into Greek? To this, no definite answer could be given. We may, however, be certain that various interpreters were occupied in translating various parts, and in all probability the interval between the commencement and the conclusion of the work was not great. The variety of the translators is provided by the unequal character of the version. Some books show that the translators were by no means competent to the task, while others, on the contrary, exhibit on the whole a careful translation. The Pentateuch is considered to be the part the best executed, while the book of Isaiah appears to be the very worst. In estimating the general character of the version, it must be remembered that the translators were Jews, full of traditional thoughts of their own as to the meaning of Scriptures, and thus nothing short of a miracle could have prevented them from infusing into the version the thoughts which were current in their own minds. They could only translate passages as they themselves understood them. This is evidently the case when their work is examined. It would be, however, too much to say that they translated with dishonest intention, for it cannot be doubted that they wished to express their Scriptures truly in Greek, and that their deviations from accuracy may be simply attributed to the incompetency of some of the interpreters and the tone of mental and spiritual feeling which was common to them all. One difficulty which they had to overcome was that of introducing theological ideas, which still then had only their proper terms in Hebrew, into a language of the Gentiles, which till then had terms for no religious notions except those of heathens. Hence the necessity of using many words and phrases in new and appropriated senses. These remarks are not intended as depreciatory of the Septuagint version, depreciatory of the Septuagint version. Their object is rather to show what difficulties the translators had to encounter, and why in some respects they failed, as well as to meet the thought which had occupied the minds of some, who would extol this version as though it possessed something resembling coordinate authority with the Hebrew text itself. So I just thought y'all would find some of that stuff interesting. I mean, it just talks about how the Septuagint came into being, and just how some of the difficulties they'd experienced in translating it, and some of the rumors and the fantastical ideas, as opposed to what some people said was the truth about the history of it. So I hope y'all enjoyed this little message about the Septuagint. I read straight from it, so I hope that some of that information helps. But if you buy it and read it yourself, you might see some of the facts that I couldn't get to. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Alright, bye.